So what would be the next thing that we would do? We've spoken about deciding to negotiate in the first place. We've spoken about a little bit of preparation. What would we do next, Chris?
There's a very small bit before we get to opening offers, which is the preamble, where you're just chatting to the person before anybody makes an opening offer. There's one bit of advice on that I think is really interesting, which is try not to open first. Ideally, you would always get the other person to open first. And the reason for this is because it might be good news. Sometimes you ask them for a price and it's really low and you think this is fantastic.
You're listening to The Growth Booth, the show focused on achieving lifestyle freedom through online businesses. Whether you're looking for step-by-step strategies to start building an online business, simple game plans to grow your business, or proven lifestyle freedom frameworks, you are in the right place. Stay tuned and be sure to join the thousands of listeners already in growth mode. Negotiation is a skill that can help you be happier and more successful in life, from parenting to relationships to businesses, literally anywhere where something is being traded, and something is almost always being traded. I think, though, unfortunately, the idea of negotiation conjures up a lot of negativity. People seem to think about, a sleazy salesman or, one person trying to take advantage of another person. But I think that's outdated and inaccurate, and it's a bit of a mistake to think about negotiation that way. I know for me, I think of negotiation as a form of communication, and I'm always trying to find a win-win. And I think when you understand that, and when you understand some skills, you can do a lot better in all areas of your life. And that's why I think it really is linked to happiness and prosperity. For me personally, from a financial standpoint, negotiation skills are without doubt one of the highest dollar per minute activities that I ever engage in. And I'll share some examples of this as we dive in here. But I know that over the past few years alone, negotiation has saved me hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of dollars, and not just savings, but has actually generated hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars in extra additional income that I couldn't have got if I didn't have an idea about how negotiation worked and didn't have the ability to sort of engage in that kind of communication. So as someone who might be unversed in negotiation, where can you start? Where can you get some quick wins? What are some simple strategies that you can use to get better results in your life? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be talking about here today. And I've invited negotiation expert Chris Croft to join us on the call. And Chris is someone that I've known for a few years now. If you want to find out more information about Chris, by the way, we will have links below this podcast on thegrowthbooth.com. But you can also just search for him in Google, Chris Croft, or go to chriscroft.com. And he's got lots of really, really great resources. And Chris is an expert in the world of negotiation. He's a true master of this craft. We actually met Chris originally because he came and did some sales and negotiation training for one of my companies, and he's helped tens of thousands of people all over the world. So I'm particularly excited about this episode, and I'm excited to have you here today, Chris. So thank you for joining us here. Before we dive in, perhaps you could give our listeners just a wee bit of background about where you are and why or how you sort of fell into this world of negotiation. And I know you do a lot of other things as well, but why negotiation? What is it that you love about it? A little bit of background.
Yes, thank you, Aidan. That's quite a build-up to live up to, isn't it? So I started out as an engineer, and I think I've still got a sort of engineer brain, just trying to understand things. And even something messy like negotiating, I want to know, what's the system? What's the process? How do you do it? But I went into management because I wasn't a great engineer. I don't think not enough attention to detail. And then I went from management into running training courses. So I'm a self-employed training person now, based in the south of England, doing Zoom training for stuff all over the world. As you mentioned, I do lots of other subjects as well, like time management and project management and things. But negotiating continues to fascinate me because people are so bad at it and people know nothing about it. And my fascination began when I first went on a training course, a negotiating training course, years ago now. And it amazed me that all these things were being done to me or had been done to me over the years without me realizing. And I just thought, oh my God, they've done, if only I'd known. I realized then that I had no idea what was being done to me. And most people don't. And I find it incredible that everyone doesn't get negotiating training. Everybody who buys stuff or sells stuff or is in a marriage or has kids, how can you not at least study this subject briefly and learn about it? Because there are simple things that work and they work pretty much every time. So the fascinating thing about negotiating is the rules are quite simple. Nobody knows them, but they do take a little bit of presence of mind to do. To remember to do them at the right moment takes practice. And I was very complimented Aidan. You said I'm a master at this. I don't think I am really, because quite often when I do a negotiation, afterwards I think, I forgot one of the rules. I did, maybe 3 out of 4 things correctly or 9 out of 10. But it's really easy to think, oh no, I didn't use, I used a round number. I quoted somebody £1,000 for training instead of 1,140. And basic things like that, easy to get wrong. So it does take practice, but there is a science behind it. There are rules you can learn, and we're going to look at some of those in a minute, I think. And it just amazes me that people don't study this. Why isn't every salesperson sent on a negotiating course? And yet, usually, they're not.
I think it should be a skill that people should really learn because, again, it's not a negative thing. It's about upping your game with regards to communication and trying to find that win-win. And to your point of forgetting one of the rules or something, I think even if you don't know all the rules, but actually you just get one of the things right, that can actually make a tangible difference. So you mentioned the whole, quoting a round number. I recently purchased a office space here in Buenos Aires in Argentina, and I was negotiating with the real estate agent or the vendor, and I quoted a quite unusual number. So I can't remember what the number was. Just to give you an example, instead of quoting like $250,000, I quoted $237,400, something like this. And he actually called me up on it and he said, what's the deal with this number? And I won't get into all the details, but I think there's a lot to be said for even just leveraging or using some of the rules. So I think if people listening to this here today can just take away 1 or 2 ideas, then there's potentially a lot of value to be had there.
Yes, you don't have to get everything right every time. Not at all. The main thing is to have the confidence to at least give it a go, because you're bound to get something. If you get $10,000 a year off your rent just by asking, that's fantastic. And the worst that's going to happen is they'll just say, no, you can't have any money off. And you're only back where you started. You've lost nothing. So you've got nothing to lose by trying. And you're right, even just 1 or 2 of the rules will bring in all sorts of benefits. It's just hard to be perfect. But I think don't beat yourself up about not being perfect. Just give it a go and regard every negotiation as practice. And just going back to the round numbers, the reason why that works, if you quote a round number, it sounds as if you're just making it up. It just sounds like a game. Whereas if you quote a very specific number, that implies there's a reason behind it. It was interesting, the bloke asked, you don't have to answer other people's questions, so you can just say, well, that's all I can afford. But I think if you say, well, we've got a very strict budget, we've worked it out really carefully, and that's all we can afford, if you're buying. And similarly, if you're selling, if you ask for an unusual number, I like numbers with 4s and 7s in, by the way. But if you ask for a price that's got a 4 or a 7 in, it implies that you've worked out your costs really carefully, and that is how much you have to charge. And quite often, if you do that, people won't negotiate with you. They'll just go, oh, okay then, because that number has a certain strength to it. It looks as if you've really calculated it. So not using round numbers is one of the many rules, and it's an important one and an easy one to do, really, isn't it?
That's, and we'll get into some more other ideas for people here shortly, but I think negotiation in business, there are lots of obvious applications. So maybe you're negotiating for some stock, or maybe you're negotiating a contract, and there's real tangibles in that. But in my personal life, I feel like negotiation pops up almost every single day. I am a foreigner living in Argentina, and like it or not, people will assume, this is a silly gringo kind of a thing. If you don't have your wits about you, you can easily get taken advantage of. I think all the time, like every single day, negotiating with my kids, negotiating with my wife, that's an ongoing battle that hopefully I keep getting better at. But it pops up all the time in life. And oftentimes when you're negotiating, it doesn't have to be that you are negotiating with another person, and it's certainly not an opponent. But if you're negotiating with a big corporation, I think that's one of the best times to do it. And an example of this was I recently negotiated some mortgage terms for a new investment that I was buying, and I was negotiating with the bank. At that point, I could feel completely good about going into that negotiation and sort of almost demanding or asking for certain things. And I could go into that with confidence, because one of the things that I did was I found out what the other options on the market were. So I knew that one bank offered this, another bank offered this, another bank offered this. Then I could speak with confidence, and I could go to my bank and say, look, I can get this elsewhere. And eventually they bettered that deal because they were interested in keeping me happy. But it wasn't like a stock standard off the shelf rate that I ended up with. It was actually significantly better with lots of other perks as well. well. So I think there's lots of upsides to negotiation in all areas of life. However, I'm sure you've seen this a lot, Chris. People sort of feel uncomfortable about negotiating. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there is an implication that you're being greedy and trying to take stuff off the other person. And I think you are absolutely right to say that there's always a win-win negotiating attitude. Every interaction you have with somebody, why are you having that interaction? And it's because you want something or they want something. And usually you have to give something in return. And that's what negotiating is. So almost every interaction is a negotiation. It's interesting you mentioned kids, because kids are born negotiators. I mean, I remember when my daughter was about 2, she would try to get me to read 3 rabbit stories instead of 1 rabbit story. And I would reluctantly agree to doing 2. And you could see her thinking, yes, I've doubled the number of rabbit stories at bedtime. So it's built in, but then it sort of is knocked out of us as we are taught about manners. You know, if somebody gives you a present, you don't go, oh, thanks, I was hoping for a bit more than that. Or can I have 2 presents? You know, we're taught you must give them something back. And that's not good negotiating. If somebody offers you a discount, you shouldn't just go, oh, no, let me give you something. You should just say, well, I'd like more than that. So in a weird way, it's knocked out of us by learning manners, and we're taught that it's rude. So I think that's part of the thing. I think the other fear we have is that it's an unstructured process. We don't know what the other person's going to do. It's probably the only interaction in life where the other person is deliberately trying to mess you up. Because even sales, as a salesperson, you're trying to help the customer to find the best solution, and they're wanting to buy and you're wanting to sell. Everything's great. But with negotiating, I suppose something like a game of chess, they're trying to mess you up. And negotiating is like that, because they're trying to work out, you know, what are your weaknesses and what do you really think? And do you really value this highly and this not very much, or the other way around? It's one of the few situations where there really is a bit of conflict going on there. And I think we try to make negotiations win-win, but sometimes the other person is playing win-lose. And if you're a win-win person, which you should be, if you go into a negotiation and the other person's playing win-lose, you are in a win-lose negotiation and there's nothing you can do. So I think we always have a fear that, you know, the other person's going to do things to us that we don't like and that we're not expecting. And at least if you have a rough outline process, which we'll come to in a minute, at least then you don't feel quite so worried. There's a final problem we have with negotiation, which is failure to get the deal. So when you're talking to the bank, you have a worry that if you try to negotiate, you might not get the money from the bank. You might not get the deal at all. And that is a totally unfounded fear. For a start, you had alternatives you could go to, which was good preparation. But even if there's nowhere else you can go, you should still negotiate with the bank, because they probably don't know there's nowhere else you can go. So you can probably get a better deal from them. And the worst case you'll have to do is crumble and go, oh, all right, then I'll just pay your number. You know, the worst thing, if you're buying and you try to get money off and they just go, nope, you can always say, oh, all right, I'll pay your full price.
It's not like they're ever going to come back and say, no, well, before you said you couldn't pay this, I'm not going to sell it to you anymore.
Oh, I'm upset. You know, providing you're nice about it. Always be nice, by the way, in any negotiation, even if the other person is awful, you know, always be nice, because you'll get a better deal.
I think that empathy is definitely one of the big tips that I've picked up over the years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, being a really good listener is part of negotiating as well, because when you're talking, you're giving away information. You know, when you're looking around a house you might buy, if you're saying, oh, this is great, this is the only one we found that's got such a big garden and we love this and we love, you're just giving away weaknesses that you've got. And they're thinking, oh, you know, they've got nowhere else to go then. So ideally, you'd be asking them, have you got somewhere to move to? And if they're moving somewhere cheaper, you can think, great, they can probably come down in price. You know, everything they tell you, they're giving away weaknesses. You know, you should be asking them, have you had many people looking? And if they say no, you think, okay. So it's all about the questioning and the listening and thinking about the other person's weaknesses. By the way, I don't want to say that win-win never happens. And the more you can find out about their position, the more chance you've got of finding a win-win. You know, you might find out, suppose you're selling, you might find out that there are several other things they're looking for as well that you can help them with. And you might be able to do a really good price for the whole lot. And if you're buying, you might find that there are other things that they sell that you might want, and you might be able to get a good deal. So the questioning helps find a win-win. And the more win-win the deal is, the better, because you're going to get a better deal from them if they're gaining from it as well. So we do want to look for the win-win, but we have to bear in mind that quite often, particularly people who haven't been trained in negotiating, often are playing win-lose, and they're just trying to get as much money or whatever off you as possible. I just wanted to add actually one more thing as well, something you said, Aidan, just now, which is this is not always about money. my daughter, it was about rabbit stories, but quite often with people, it's about when can you have something and what will they do for you and how good will it be and can they help you with other things? And I think the best negotiations are not about money at all, or they're about money plus a load of other things. It's when it's only money, that's when you end up with a win-lose negotiation, because you've got nothing else you can put in. You just have to fight over the price. And that's not an ideal negotiation. You want to get extras in as well if you can.
I think there are always at least a few different variables or levers you can touch on. One of them being the price or the cost, another one being the time frame, and another one being the quality or the quantity of something. In your daughter's case, the quantity of bedtime stories that you might be reading. So there are normally multiple levers there, but people do tend to sort of focus on price. And just before we get into some of the steps, another thing that came to mind while you were talking there was oftentimes people get emotional about it, especially when they are not well versed in negotiating and they just want to have a win. Sometimes by letting them have that win or letting them feel like they won, even though you're probably not trying to operate in a zero-sum game, you're probably trying to find that middle ground where it is win-win. Sometimes by just letting the other party in the negotiation feel like they've won, that can be a really good way of getting to a win-win situation.
And just a small win. I mean, years ago I was selling a car secondhand and I added 100 quid to the price because I knew they'd want 100 off. And the guy said, if you can give me £100 off, I'll buy it. And I went, okay, done. Because I'd added it on, and he was really sort of triumphant and great, which you shouldn't be, by the way. You don't want to look triumphant after a negotiation. And I was thinking, I just put that on so I could take it off. So you're right. Sometimes you have to give them a small win.
I think you actually want to look, normally after a negotiation, you sort of want to look like, oh, well, you really made me work for this. I was at my absolute limit here. And, I'm happy with the outcome. But now, getting into the steps, in the past we've spoken, when we've had you do training for some of our audience, we've spoken about 5 different steps. And I believe the first one was sort of deciding to negotiate in the first place. Hopefully we've given people a few clues about that. And then we started speaking about... By the way, that is the biggest reason.
That is the biggest reason why people don't get a good deal. They don't even try. So that is an important one. Sorry, carry on.
It's often the case, you don't try and obviously you just don't get anything. But then I think the next one was preparation. So what would you sort of share with people a few easy wins they can have by preparation?
Yeah, if I could have a top 2, I think my number 1 tip of everything is set your limit. Know at what point you're going to walk away. So if you're selling, how low will you go before you just think this is not worth it? And you might really want that customer. You might be prepared to do it for a loss, or the customer might be a bit of a pain and you might be busy and you might think, I'm only going to do this if I get a really good price. But what is your walk away point? And if you're buying, what's the most you'll pay? At what point will you actually say, no, forget it, I'm not going to buy this? Even if it means you can't do a whole big other thing without this one thing you're trying to buy. At what point will you say, get stuffed, I'm not paying that? And that requires a little bit of careful thinking beforehand. But it will mean you won't do a deal that's a bad one. But it will also make you stronger. Because when you're in there, you know the point at which you will walk. So you're not in there thinking, oh, I don't know, should I agree to a bit more or not? There's no worrying, there's no thinking, because you know your walk-away point before you start.
You're not going to get caught out on the fly by sort of being unprepared, because that's when the emotional side of it really comes in. And
it can get messy.
And you can sort of make mistakes. And
you're under pressure and the person's there. And, so have that absolutely ready before you go in. I sometimes even write it on a piece of paper and put it in my pocket before I go in. So
last time I bought a car, I actually had I knew what the car was being sold for, and before I went into the car dealership, I had a price which was my absolute maximum price that I was going to pay. Yeah, I think without having that, it's easy to get sucked up into the emotion or into the negotiation tactics of the other party. Obviously, some people are negotiating every single day like car salesmen. It's a good sort of safety net, I think, to have that.
Absolutely. That's rule number 1. I think the other thing you can prepare is just think about their weaknesses. And this comes back to how we were saying earlier on, that people feel weak when they go into a negotiation. So, just stick with that car example. You may think they've got all the cards, they've got the car, they know the game, but they've got weaknesses. That car salesperson is probably either on a bonus and they're desperate to sell it because they want the money, or maybe they have not had a good month and maybe they're even going to get fired if they don't sell a car by the end of today and you're the only customer they've had. Maybe that car has been on their books for weeks and they just can't get rid of it, and you happen to be the only person who likes that car.
You never know what
you never know
the other person is thinking or going through. And that's why you might think you're giving a lowball offer, whereas for them, it's absolutely amazing.
Yes, they may have bought it for almost nothing. And that's another weakness they may have. So by thinking about their weaknesses, it makes you feel stronger. So and it takes the attention off your weaknesses. So you go in just thinking, I bet he's desperate to sell this car, or I bet she has sold nothing this week and is desperate to make a sale. And that just makes you feel stronger when you go in. And it gives you things to look for as well. So then when you say to them, how's it been recently? They may well say, it's been terrible. We haven't sold anything for ages. And you could think, aha. So preparing their weaknesses is really time well spent. And of course, you only have to do it once. I mean, that's the other thing. If you are, for example, if you're selling cars, you've only got to think about the buyer's weaknesses once, and then you've got that for your whole life. Every buyer that comes in, you can think, I bet they're rich. I bet they've fallen in love with this car. I bet they're under time pressure because their other car's broken down, or whatever it might be. So do that work once, you've got it forever.
Another way I think people can prepare is just to get themselves in a little bit more of a position of strength. So for example, when I was negotiating with the bank, I knew what the other banks were offering, and I didn't have all my hopes resting on this one bank. If they had said no, then I had other options. And in the online space, we do this with suppliers all the time. So one of our businesses, we've got our own brands of products. We import them into the United States. We sell them online, but offline in tens of thousands of different stores. And we've got multiple suppliers for each product. So when we are negotiating terms, if one supplier isn't willing to play ball or isn't willing to try to find that win-win, then we're not desperate. We can move on to the next person. And I feel like with our e-commerce business, that was one of the biggest sort of breakthroughs we had, was moving away from just having one supplier to having multiple suppliers. I think it's putting you more in a position of strength. So that's sort of preparation as well. Anything else you want to mention about preparation? Otherwise we could go on to the next.
No, not really. Only to say, if you don't have another supplier, you can still tell yourself, I don't need this one. I will find one if I have to. So if I'm negotiating with a customer, it's not like I've got an alternative customer, because, I'd like them both, but I still am prepared to walk away, because I still think to myself, if I don't get this job, somebody else will phone me this afternoon or tomorrow, I'll get another one. So I always believe there's an alternative, because that gives me that walk-away power, even if I don't actually have one. Of course, as you say, it's best if you've got one or several lined up. But often you've got a favourite one, but you have to still believe.
You don't want to be you don't want to sort of psychologically be in a position where you're feeling desperate, because that really will sort of set you up to be in a weak position. So anything you can do to make yourself feel stronger coming into a negotiation, I think.
So you fall in love with a house and you think, I've got to have this one. But you have to say to yourself, there will be, and if I don't buy this one, I'll find one next week that'll probably be better. And you have to believe that. And it's probably true, actually. You will find one. And we've probably all had situations where that's happened even. It's fallen through and, a month later we bought one and it was better. So you have to tell yourself that and really, really believe that. And then you're stronger. So yeah, I would say, because we don't have a lot of time, that's all we should say about preparing for now.
So what would be the next thing that we would do? We've spoken about deciding to negotiate in the first place. We've spoken about a little bit of preparation. What would we do next, Chris?
Well, there's a very small bit before we get to opening offers, which is the preamble, where you're just chatting to the person before anybody makes an opening offer. And I think there's one bit of advice on that I think is really interesting, which is try not to open first. Now, you may have to open first. If you're selling, they may just say, well, what's the price? But even then, you can sometimes say, well, it depends what you want. Do you have a budget in mind? And if you give me a rough idea of what you're looking for, I could... And that's what they do in kitchen and carpet showrooms. They ask you for your budget, don't they? So ideally, you wouldn't say how quickly you want something. You'd say, when can I have it? And ideally, you would always get the other person to open first. And the reason for this is because it might be good news. Sometimes you ask them for a price and it's really low and you think, this is fantastic.
Funny story about that, Chris. I had a friend who was offering some services to casinos in Las Vegas, and the casino sort of said to them, what are your charges? And my friend didn't really know, what he should be charging. He was new in this game. So he just said $100,000. And the casino said, okay, that's fine, $100,000. And then they sent through the contract. And my friend found out that instead of getting a one-time payment of $100,000, he was now getting $100,000 per month, because the casino were expecting one thing, he was expecting another thing, and he had the good fortune of sort of being on the end of something that turned into $100,000 a month. He would have been absolutely over the moon with just sealing a $100,000 one-time sort of offer there. So it goes to show you never know.
That's much better than my story. Weirdly, I was going to give an example to do with Las Vegas as well, actually, by an incredible coincidence. I was asked to speak at a conference in Las Vegas. It was like an HR conference. They wanted to talk on difficult people, I think it was. Do I open first or do they open first? Because I've no idea what they pay for a 45-minute talk to 300 people in a conference. It could be anything from $1,000 to $20,000. So if I say, I want $9,000 to do that talk, they might well think, wow, he's cheap. We'd have paid 15. So I've got to say to them, I might be able to do it, but I'm pretty busy. What do you pay for this? And they might say, well, we can only afford 18,000, in which case I'm going to bite their hand off. So you can see, if you can manage to get them to open first, it could be good news. If it's bad news, if they say, well, it's only $50, then I can always say, oh, well, no, I want 15,000. And then it's just game on, isn't it? And maybe they can't afford me. Maybe they can. Maybe we end up halfway on 7. And I'd be delighted, by the way, to do it for that. Always ask them to open first. If it's good news, it's great. If it's bad news, you can just ignore it. And there are some people who say, no, open first to stick a stake in the ground. But I don't agree with that at all, because what if you stick the stake in the wrong place, And it's such an unknown game. You want them to stick their stake in first.
Sometimes you are really sort of forced to open first. And a strategy that I've used in that scenario is, and I'm sure you've heard about this one, it's called the Ackerman bargaining method. It's where you've got this price in your mind. Like you might be thinking, okay, well, the most I could absolutely pay for this, my absolute maximum price is $1,000. And then if that's the maximum you're willing to pay, then you start your original price at 65% of that. So you'd say, okay, well, I could pay $650. And this is going to devalue the item's perceived worth, at least at the start of the negotiating. And then maybe they'll come back and say, oh, no, I can't do that. In your second offer, you'll offer 85% of the reservation price, and then they'll come back and do something else. And then you'll come back with an offer of 95% of whatever the asking price is. And you might end up at 100% of what you were willing to pay. And if you end up getting it for that, whatever it is, then you'll probably be happy because it sort of fell into your line of rules anyway. But if you don't, at least you know that you tried, and at least you sort of started by anchoring the conversation with significantly less than what you were willing to pay. So whenever I'm in doubt, that's a little formula that I've gone back to, and people can find that if they just search for the Ackerman bargaining method. You'll find it in Google. There's lots of things written about that.
I'd like to add a couple of things to that because I like it, and in principle I think it's right. I think the only thing I would say is that your formula said you should start on, was it 75% of what you would
65?
pay? 65. And I think that range depends on the situation a little bit. It could be situational. So if you're buying, ask for lower. Obviously, if you're selling, you ask for higher. Ask for lower than the best you might get. So if you've looked at the market and it's very wide and you never know, you might get it for half price. You've got to ask for less than half. So my example of speaking in Las Vegas, that's a very wide market. So if I'd be happy to do it for, say, $2,000, I could ask for 3 or 4. But if I think there's a chance they might pay 10, I should ask for 11. So I think my rule, for the Croft rule for opening offers, is go beyond the best you might get. And you can sometimes find that out by just market research, by looking at what all the different prices are out there.
Yeah, because you also don't want to sort of offend someone out of the gate by just
No, and you must be very nice about it, and you must just say, look, and you need to justify your opening offer. So if I'm going to ask for 10 grand to go and talk for 45 minutes in Vegas, I've got to be able to justify that. And I can either say it's going to take me several days of travel to get there and back with jet lag, which is true. Or I can say that I've got lots of other people asking me to do talks and they're all offering me 10 grand. And that's why it seems like a lot, but that's the going rate. So I've got to be able to justify my extreme opening offer. And I need to think about that in advance.
I think sometimes it's easier to use the Ackerman method that I mentioned when you're negotiating for something which isn't readily available. Buying a property and there are 100 other houses on the market, but perhaps you are buying a piece of a business or something where there is no surefire formula for figuring out exactly what something might be worth. It's more subjective. That's when I've sort of used that.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to add with that, suppose you're selling and somebody says, that's too expensive, can you come down a bit? You could use a formula to work out what you should come down to. But my first line of defense is to not come down at all. So if somebody says, oh, that's a bit expensive for a training course, my first thing is to say, well, I just can't come down, I'm afraid, because, I've got costs and I've got other people asking me to do it for that rate, or however I justify it, I say, I just can't come down. And I've found that probably 3/4 of the time, they just go, oh, well, okay then, I just thought I'd ask. So, say no the first time, and only if they come back a second time and say, well, in that case, we can't afford it. And, in that case, we'll just have to call it a day. Goodbye. You can then say, well, look, hang on a minute. Maybe there's a way I could come down a little bit. If you book me twice, or if you give me some nice food when I come to see you, then I could maybe come down a small amount. I shouldn't be giving this away, should I? People are going to know this now. But it's
how to negotiate with Chris Croft. Head over to thegrowthbooth.com and you'll find out.
Yes.
I think the other thing that we always need to keep coming back to is there are really multiple different levers here. So it's not just about the cost, it's about time, it's about quality and molding or sort of bending different things to find what could work. So if we move on now to, and I am really conscious of your time here, Chris, but if we move on to the next step in the process, we've spoken a little bit about opening. Is there anything else that you wanted to add to opening? Or
no, I think my two top rules of opening are open just beyond the best you could hope for, because otherwise you'll never get the best you could hope for, and don't open with a round number, so that you don't sound as if you're playing a game. You sound as if you've got a definite, and if you've got a reason why that to be able to defend that number as well, that's great. So let's say you've opened and they've opened. The next bit of the process is how do we get to some agreement in the middle? And this is the bargaining or the trading sort of, well, I might be able to do it. If you do this, I could do this sort of part of it. And people think this is what negotiating is. But actually, by the time you get to this stage, it's more or less over. Because, if I'm at one end, you're at the other end, we're going to end up roughly in the middle. I might be able to pull you to sort of 2/3. So the difference between a half and 2/3 is a sixth, I think, isn't it? So there's not a lot to be got. But nevertheless, it's worth trying to get that sixth. But, the opening offer is absolutely crucial. So how do we bargain? And the two rules of bargaining I want to share with you. One of them is very, very simple, which is move in small steps. And, that's just obvious, because if you move in big steps, you're giving away more. But when we do role plays on training courses, this is the mistake that people always make. They always say, I can only afford 4,000. And then they go, all right, how about 8,000? And you think, what? You should have gone from 4 to 4.1, So move in small steps, because not only are you giving away less, but it sends a signal. If you go to 4.1, you're going to say you're going to be lucky to get to 4.5, mate. So small steps, that's obvious. And yet people don't do it. The other bargaining rule is a lot more tricky, and maybe we need to spend a little bit of time talking about it. I know we haven't got much more time on this, but is to always trade. So if I say to somebody, I want 10 grand to do a job for you, and you say, well, we can only afford 2, and I go, all right, I'll do it for 5. You're thinking, well, hang on, what was that 10 you mentioned just now? You tried to rip me off at 10, because you've now told me you're prepared to do it for 5. And even if I come from 10, I go 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. By the time I get to 5, you're thinking, this guy started at 10 and I don't like that. Quite right. So how do I get from my opening offer, which has to be a little bit extreme, trying my luck, I might get it, to some sort of finishing point without looking dishonest? And the key is, if you book more days, I'll do it cheaper. If you give me curry for lunch, I'll do it for cheaper. If you mention me on your website, I'll do it for cheaper. And I need to have things that I can trade, kind of as an excuse to come down, but not just an excuse. Because if I come down from 10 to 5 and I get on your website and all these other things, then I've actually got perhaps a really good deal for me. I would probably rather do it for less, but be on your website. So trading leads to a win-win, because you get a cheaper job and it's easy for you to put me on your website.
I've got one example.
Yeah, give us your example, Aidan.
I've got one example where this happened to me, real life negotiating. I was buying a condo in Manhattan in New York, and we got down to, maybe we were sort of haggling over the final sort of $30,000. There was a bit of a gap there, and the vendor said, okay, well, the offer is going to be, and I can't remember what it was, but just as an example, let's say it was $650,000, and maybe I was stuck on 620 or something. And what we did using this trading, I said, okay, well, look, I can up my offer a little bit, but you're going to include the Sub-Zero fridge. And the Sub-Zero fridge is something that was worth $15,000. Turns out that the vendor didn't care about the Sub-Zero fridge. It was one less thing he was going to have to shift out of the property, as well as a whole bunch of other furniture that he had. And it meant that I could sort of save face. I wasn't just willing to sort of like jump in price when I'd already said that I was sort of at my limit, but I could justify doing that if I was getting something else. So it was another one of those examples where just by sort of asking the question or being aware of the tradables, the things that are, up for negotiation here, you can sort of work those into the contract. And I think that's another thing that you can do in your preparation, at least for this part of the negotiation, is is make a list. Well, what are the tradables?
It's a vital part of preparation is to think about your tradables. And because if you've done that, you feel stronger when you go in. And we talked earlier about how people have a fear of negotiating because you're going into the unknown. But if you know your walk-away point and you know your tradables and you've got your opening offer planned, you're going in feeling much better about the whole thing. And your tradables are like a little pack of cards and you just play one, play another one, play a big one, play a small one. You feel great because you've got all these tradables and you know where you are. And as I mentioned before, you've only got to prepare them once. So, you probably don't buy condos in Manhattan very often, but, particularly when you're selling, you can have the same tradables every time.
Yeah. And you can use this also in just an online business. I keep coming back to e-commerce because it's an easy one to make examples out of. But for example, I can't pay $1 per unit if I'm buying 1,000 different products, and the manufacturer is saying, look, these are going to cost you $1 per unit, and I'm sort of saying, well, my maximum I can pay is 80 cents per unit. Then another thing that I can trade is say, okay, well, I can pay $1 per unit if you sell them to me in smaller batches. So instead of having me on the hook for buying 1,000 units up front, I'll buy 500 of them, and I'm willing to pay a little bit more of a higher price if I'm getting a smaller batch. Or maybe I can say, yeah, well, I'll pay a little bit more if you get them to me faster. So there's always something that you can kind of add in there if you just think it through.
Absolutely. Ideally, you'd go in with about 10 tradables, and just sit down with some people, brainstorm a list. You'd be amazed how many tradables there are, and some great examples there. And there's when you pay and whether you can cancel a week beforehand and packaging, it's loads.
Another little example there, Chris. I mentioned earlier that I've recently purchased an office space here in Argentina. And one of the things that I ended up trading was I was able to pay the seller outside of Argentina. So for him, that was a benefit. He wanted to get properties in Argentina are sold mainly in US dollars. I was able to say, look, I'll pay you for this, and I'm going to be able to pay you for it into a bank account that you've got in the United States. So you're not going to end up with a big lump of money here in Argentina. And that was really, really appealing for him because it meant that he was able to have his money sort of outside Argentina, which is something that he wanted. So yeah,
and it's easy for you. So it's win-win.
It was easier for me. There was a genuine win-win that came out of the negotiation there. So another good
and the great thing
example.
about tradables is almost always they have different values to the two parties. So I can give you something that's cheap for me to give and valuable to you. And then you can do something that's really valuable for me that you can easily give. And so something like payment in a different country or, being mentioned on somebody's website or something like that is, for example, I'll mention this podcast on my LinkedIn feed, which goes out to 100,000 people. So to you, that's great. And it's great to me as well, because I've got to think of something good to put on my LinkedIn feed, So win-wins are everywhere when you start looking at tradables. Money's the problem because money's very difficult. Money's never win-win because every pound I get off you, I win, but you lose. So tradables are absolutely the key to a win-win. Anyway, should we go to the last step, which is the close?
Let's go to the last one.
Yeah, and so eventually, after all this trading and things, we end up at some sort of deal, hopefully. What would I say would be my top tip for when you get to the close? And I think look out for the nibble. I would say here, the nibble is a real killer. And the nibble is when you agree it, you shake hands verbally or physically, and then they go, oh, by the way, you don't mind delivering on a Sunday, do you? Or I had one of these recently. I agreed to do a Zoom session for an American customer, and I'm in England. And it was all done, and it was all fine. And they said, oh, yeah, so by the way, we're going to have it at 2 p.m. I hope that's all right with you. And that was 2 p.m. LA time. So it was something like midnight for me. But we'd already agreed everything, the price, everything else, And I'm thinking, oh, what? I've got to do this thing at midnight. Now, if they'd said at the beginning, can you do a training session on Zoom at midnight? I'd have gone, yeah, but it'll cost you. And I would have made them, I actually don't mind too much doing stuff at midnight, but I would have made them pay extra for it. And sometimes they nibble and they say, we agree everything. And then I discover they've got 500 people on the Zoom call. And again, if I'd known that earlier, I would have said, well, it's going to cost X per person. And I would have charged them a lot more because I had more people. And so the nibble is when something comes up to the surface after you've done the deal. So what can you do to prevent the nibble? And obviously, do your pre-work. Just think, right, time zone, number of people. And after a while, you've been caught once on all these things. You don't want to be caught twice. So you have a little list of things to check. The other way to get around the nibble is to say, are there any extras I need to know about? Because sometimes, they want, let's say they want, special packaging or something like that. If you say halfway through, is there anything else I need to know about? And they say, nope. at the end, when they say, oh, by the way, can we have special packaging? Or you can say, well, you didn't mention that earlier. So that's going to cost extra. And I think the key thing is to not let people get away with the nibble. Because once you've done the deal, you're feeling good and it's in the bag. And it's very tempting at that point to just agree to extra things. Let's say you've bought a house, you shake hands, and then afterwards say, oh, by the way, you don't mind if we take the magnolia tree from the front garden, do you? And you're so delighted to have got the house. You say to them, no, that's fine. But hang on a minute, you've just lost $100 there. And what you should say is, no, I'm not happy with you taking the tree. That's part of the reason I wanted the house. So if you want to take it, because it's got sentimental value, you were given it as a wedding present or something, I'll have to replace it with another one. It's probably going to cost me $150. So you could take it, but you'll have to knock $150 off the price of the house. But it's only $150, isn't it? And you're almost sort of like nibbling back. It's only $150, so you can take that off the price, can't you? Don't let them get away with it. Because if you lost $150 out of your pocket in the car park, you'd be gutted. So why should you let that happen just because you've bought a really expensive house? Don't let them steal a few % off you after you've done the deal.
And I think also keeping at the forefront of your mind why you are in a position of strength and what your walkaway point is. And if something doesn't work out or you don't quite get there, even if you're very close to getting a deal and you just can't quite get there, it's not the end of the world if you have to sort of walk away there. So this has been amazing, Chris. And having worked with you in the past, I know that you could speak for days on end about negotiation, and it's such a deep topic. But I think we've given people a good sort of starting point here, deciding to negotiate in the first place, doing a little bit of preparation to put you in a good position, the opening, trading, and the things that you can sort of bargain or barter on, and then closing as well. So people can find out more about your different trainings by just doing a search for Chris Croft in Google or going to chriscroft.com, and we will have the links to your website below this on thegrowthbooth.com. So Chris, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day here to share more of your tips with our audience. People in our audience absolutely love this stuff, so I really appreciate you being here today. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. It's been great. It's been fun chatting about all this. I'll see you again
We'll have
soon.
to do it again soon.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes, Aidan. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Look, guys, this is a wrap for this episode. Make sure you join us on the next episode where we're going to be talking about productivity and getting more done. You'll be able to hear from the author of The 12-Week Year, Brian P. Moran, about how you can get more done in your life. So make sure you tune in to the next podcast episode here on thegrowthbooth.com.